Can be agreed to.
Speaker.
Call Charles Cheval.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could I begin by congratulating the new Minister on her portfolio of corrections and wishing her well in her tenure in the role. I agree with what she said about the importance of the sector, and I was fortunate in my time in legal practice to have some connection with the department, representing it from 1994 through to about 2006 in various court cases where the legality of actions of the department were challenged in various courts around the country. And I had the opportunity to do that both when I was working at the Crown Law Office and in private practice. And over that time I got to see the culture changes that were going on in the Department of Corrections from the mid-90s, in fact when it was still a part of the old Department of Justice, through to only 4 or 5, 6 years ago. Those culture changes are encouraging, and I think they are ones that it is in the interests of every member of this Parliament to encourage and to support, because as the Minister said, we do want a system that contains people securely where that is required, but also, and much more importantly for the long term, deals effectively with habilitation and rehabilitation. And certainly that's something that I very much want the system to continue to re-gear to do, and to do that much more quickly than we've been able to see it so far. Sir, the legislation before us is something of a mixed bag, and I think probably the proof of that is the fact that there are 5 different regulatory impact statements on the legislation, because effectively there have been 5 different cabinet papers leading to the legislation that we're considering today. I think there are some sensible measures in the bill. I think the legislation that will deal, for example, with the self-employment of prisoners is one that it would be very difficult for anybody to argue with. That should be put on a secure footing. The whole inmate employment scheme has been a success, and it's one that again receives support from this side of the House. But sir, there are provisions in the legislation that are of concern. The Minister in her speech mentioned the provision of health services in our prisons, and she said that there would be some changes made to the way in which those services are provided. Well, the problem that Labour members have with the provisions in the bill concerning health services is that they seem to run quite counter to the recommendations of a very recent report of the Office of the Ombudsman on the provision of health services in prisons. In the Ombudsman's investigation of the Department of Corrections in relation to the provision, access and availability of prisoner health services, the Ombudsman said that taxpayers would actually get much better value for money if prison health services were delivered by an external health agency under the aegis, for example, of the local DHB, rather than by corrections itself. But this legislation puts the responsibility for the provision of health services to employees onto the Department of Corrections rather than onto medical officers. That is in exactly the opposite direction to the move proposed by the Ombudsman. And so Labour members, accepting that the government is likely to have the support needed to send this legislation to a select committee, will want to have a look at that provision with particular care and detail at the select committee. Another provision that is of concern, sir, relates to the restraint of inmates in mechanical restraints. At the moment, the law says that a visiting justice has to approve keeping an inmate in restraints for more than 24 hours, and that provision would go under this legislation as I read it. And, for example, there'd be a provision allowing a medical officer in the prison to certify that for reasons to prevent self-harm, for example, an inmate could be kept in mechanical restraint for longer than 24 hours. Well, again at the Select Committee, I think it'll be very important to ensure that there are sufficient safeguards in respect of that exercise. Back on the issue of medical services in prisons, sir, The bill removes the requirement that there be a medical officer appointed to each prison, and the replacement provision reads that there should simply be a sufficient number of medical officers to meet prisoners' needs for medical care and medical treatment. Now, sir, I'd be concerned if what that meant at a smaller prison like New Plymouth, if the effect of that was that there wouldn't have to be a medical officer actually resident or based in that location, but able to serve, for example, in Whanganui and act at a distance. I think, again, it's the sort of thing that the Select Committee will want to take a good, long, hard look at. Sir, there were, as I say, other provisions which cause some concern to members on this side of the House. The Minister mentioned in her speech increased powers relating to strip searches.
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. The time has come for me to leave the chair. This debate is interrupted. I shall resume the chair at 7:30.